The slap landed so hard, her water glass tipped over and rolled off the bar. Marin Vance did not flinch. She did not cry out. She turned her head back toward the man who had hit her, slow and unhurried, and something in her eyes made three grown sailors at the next table stop laughing in the middle of a sentence. Nobody in that room understood yet that the quiet woman they had ignored all night was about to end a career in less time than it takes to finish a breath. For this goes further, subscribe and follow the channel so you do not miss where this story ends. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see how far across the world this story travels. Now let us begin. Marin Vance had been sitting at the far right end of the bar for 40 minutes before anyone said a word to her, and that was exactly the way she wanted it. The place was called Salt and Iron, 3 miles off the back gate of the base at Virginia Beach, the kind of bar where the jukebox only knew 3 decades of music and the owner knew which regulars needed cutting off before they turned ugly. On a Friday night, it filled with the same crowd it always filled with. Young sailors burning off a week of training, a few contractors, 2 old men in the corner who had been coming here since before half the room was born. She had chosen the right end of the bar, the way she chose everything, which was to say deliberately, which was to say for a reason she never explained to anyone. Her left ear had taken a pressure wave 11 years earlier, and it had never fully come back. 40% gone, according to a doctor she saw once and never went back to see again. On the right end of that bar, her good ear faced the room. Every voice, every scrape of a chair, every door that opened behind her came in clean. It was not paranoia, it was arithmetic. She had done that arithmetic in every room she had entered for over a decade, and she no longer noticed herself doing it the way a person does not notice breathing. She wore a plain gray shirt and jeans, hair pulled back, no jewelry, nothing on her face except something cheap to keep the windburn down. If a stranger had looked at her and tried to guess her life, that stranger would have guessed wrong in every direction. A school administrator, a nurse coming off shift, somebody's quiet sister-in-law who did not drink. She liked it that way. She had worked for that. It had taken her almost 3 years to unlearn the things that gave people like her away. The squared shoulders, the habit of counting exits before sitting down, the way trained bodies settle their backs against walls without ever consciously choosing to. She had softened her posture on purpose, the way another person might learn a second language, and most nights the work held. Tonight the work was holding. Barely. 6 stools down, Bryce Tanner was building something entirely different out of the same evening. I was 35, built like a loading dock, with a haircut that made his skull look permanently annoyed. 3 beers in, and just hitting the part of the night he liked best, the part where he held the floor, and 4 younger sailors orbited him like he was the only source of light in the building. He was telling them about training. He was telling them about what separated real people from the ones who only played at it. He was telling them in the roundabout way that men like him always tell it, that they were lucky to be sitting near him at all. None of what he said was technically a lie. All of it was arranged carefully enough to leave out the part where he had never once been shot at. Danny Okafor sat at the end of that table and did not laugh at the right places. I was 26, a corpsman, and he had a habit that his friends found funny and occasionally irritating, which was that he read rooms the way other men read box scores. He could not turn it off. He had tried. He noticed the tremor in a hand before the man holding it noticed. He noticed which people in a crowd were tracking exits. And somewhere around the 30-minute mark of that Friday night, Okafor noticed something about the woman at the far right end of the bar that made the back of his neck go cold and stay cold. She had not touched her phone, not once. He timed it after that because he could not help himself. 10 minutes. 15, nothing. She did not check it. She did not turn it face up. She did not do the small unconscious reach that almost every human being in a public place performs every 90 seconds, whether they need to or not. She sat with both hands around a glass of water, and she watched the room slowly, without ever appearing to watch anything. He mentioned it quietly to the man beside him and got laughed at for it. He was told he was doing the thing again. The thing where he stared at strangers like he was trying to lift fingerprints off their faces. He was told it was creepy. He said he was observant and that there was a difference, and the table moved on, and Okafor did not move on because the hum at the base of his skull had started up and it was not stopping. He had felt that hum 4 times in his life. Twice it had been nothing. Twice it had not. Outside through the front window, a white logistics truck sat at the edge of the gravel lot with its engine off. A driver leaned against the cab, smoking, looking in through the glass, a beat longer than a man waiting on a delivery has any reason to look. Nobody inside the bar noticed. Okafor did not notice. It was the one thing his instincts missed that night, and it would take him a long time to forgive himself for it later. Marin noticed. She noticed and filed it and let it go. Because a truck in a gravel lot outside a bar near a naval installation is the most ordinary object in the world. And because she had spent 3 years teaching herself to stop treating ordinary things as threats. That was supposed to be progress. That was what the counselor she stopped seeing had called it. Progress. She was not there to hunt for threats. She was there because the silence in her rented house had grown teeth again. That was the part nobody in that bar would have believed if she had told them. She did not come to salt and iron for company or for noise or for a man. She came because it was the only place within 20 miles where she could sit surrounded by other human beings without any of them expecting a single thing from her. She could hold a glass of water and let the sound of 40 ordinary lives wash over her and pretend for 2 or 3 hours that she was one of them, that she had a week worth complaining about, that her worst memory was a bad supervisor. She had unpacked most of her house 11 months ago. 2 boxes still sat in the closet. She had not opened them, and she knew exactly what was in them, and she knew exactly why she had not opened them, and that was the entire architecture of her life in one sentence. Tanner had been building toward her for 20 minutes without admitting it to himself. That was the mechanism, and it was older than either of them. He had a room. He had an audience. And there was one person in that room who had not given him a single thread of attention all night, who had not laughed, who had not glanced over, who had not registered his existence in any measurable way. For most people, that would be nothing. For Bryce Tanner, it was a wound, and the wound got louder with every beer. Okafor watched his friend's eyes find her the way water finds the lowest point in a room, and he said something quiet across the table. He said, "Leave it." He said, "Whatever you are about to do not do it." Tanner grinned back at him with the specific grin of a man who had never taken that advice in his life and saw no reason to start now, said he was only going to be friendly, and slid off his stool. He announced to the table that they should watch this. Okafor did not watch it. He tracked it, which is a different thing, and the hum at the base of his skull went from background noise to something closer to an alarm. Tanner came down the bar, loud on purpose, each step a little too heavy, a man performing for an audience he had already won. He leaned an elbow on the bar close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers and asked her if she was always this much fun. She did not look up from the glass. She told him she was not there to be fun. He laughed, checked over his shoulder to make sure his table was watching, and asked what she was there for then. Hiding from somebody. Husband forgot a birthday. She told him she was having a drink. Her voice did something to the air that nobody in the bar could have named. It was not cold. It was not frightened. It was flat in a way that offered him absolutely nothing to push against the verbal equivalent of a wall with no handholds, and men like Tanner have no idea what to do with a wall like that except hit it harder. He picked up her glass before she could stop him, sniffed it, made a show of the face, announced to the room that it was water. That was the first mistake, and only 2 people in the building understood it. Gus Merrick, 61 years old, 22 years in the Navy, before he ever poured a drink for a living, missing the top joint of one finger, and famous for never once explaining how stopped, wiping the glass in his hand. And Danny Okafor, 6 stools away, felt his stomach drop for a reason he could not articulate. Because the woman had not reacted. At all. A stranger had taken an object out of her hands, and her hands had stayed exactly where they were, relaxed, open. Resting on the bar, Okafor had seen 1,000 people get their drink taken. Every one of them tensed, every single one. She did not. Tanner set the glass down too hard, and water sloshed over the rim, and he told her it was insulting coming into a bar full of sailors on a Friday night to drink water, like she thought she was better than everyone in the room. She said she had not said that. He said she had not needed to. Gus offered him a round on the house in a voice that was not really an offer. Tanner did not even look at him. He leaned in closer and told her that this bar was for people who had actually done something, and that if she wanted to sit in a corner, being mysterious, she could do it somewhere else. At his table, one of the young ones let out a low whistle that was half delight and half discomfort. Nobody laughed. That was the moment the room began to turn, and Tanner missed it completely because he had already stopped listening to anything except the sound of his own escalation. She told him she was not bothering anyone and that she would appreciate it if he did the same. And that landed wrong, and Okafor watched it land wrong and understood exactly why. There was no fear in it. There was no deference in it. Tanner was used to two responses from women in bars: laughter or dismissal, and both of them acknowledged him. Both of them confirmed he existed. What she had just done was look straight through the middle of him, as though he were weather, and something in his chest could not survive that. He mocked the word appreciate. He said, listen to her like she is somebody. She said she had never claimed to be anybody. He said, no, she was just sitting there acting like the rest of them were beneath her, and his voice climbed enough that heads turned down the length of the bar. Then he said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his career. He told her he thought she was scared, that she had walked into a bar full of real operators and gotten frightened and was now hiding behind a little glass of water like it was going to protect her. For the first time all night, Marin Vance turned her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were a pale, flat brown, and there was nothing behind them for him to grab. No anger, no hurt, no fear, nothing that gave him a single inch of purchase. She told him he should go back to his friends. It was not a request, and it was not quite a warning. She said it the way a person tells a stranger that a building is about to close. Gus set his rag down and put both hands flat on the bar and told Tanner to step back from her. Okafor was already half off his stool without having decided to stand. And Tanner, 3 beers deep with an audience of 4, did the thing that people like him always do at exactly this point, which is that he asked her what her problem was. She said she did not have a problem. He said she could have fooled him. She told him again in the exact same voice, using the exact same words, in the exact same order, that he should go back to his friends. That was the second mistake, and it was hers, though she would have argued later that she had no better option. She repeated herself word for word, which is a thing trained people do without thinking, because a repeated instruction delivered identically is the last controlled step before something stops being controlled. It is a courtesy. It is a countdown. Tanner heard it as contempt. And that was when his pride, already swollen past its own structure, finally split all the way through. He told her not to tell him what to do, and his hand was already moving before the sentence finished. The slap cracked across her left cheek, open palm, hard enough that the sound of it went through salt and iron like a drop plate on a tile floor. The glass tipped and went over the edge. Her head snapped sideways. And for one full second, nothing in that building made any sound at all except a jukebox. Nobody was listening to anymore. She did not cry out. She did not come off the stool. She did not put a hand to her face the way almost every human being on the planet would have. She turned her head back toward him, slowly, unhurried, the way a person turns to look at something mildly interesting on a sidewalk, and she looked at him. There was no fear in that look. That was the part that broke the room. 40 people, most of them trained, all of them braced for the thing they knew came next, which was the shock and the humiliation and the tears on the face of a woman who has just been struck in public. None of it arrived. What arrived instead was worse and quieter and impossible for any of them to name. She was calculating. She was looking at Bryce Tanner the way an engineer looks at a crack that has just appeared in something she is responsible for. Tanner laughed. It came out short and ugly and wrong, a man throwing noise at a silence he had created and could not stand, and he asked her whether she had nothing to say now. She did not answer him. She reached up slowly, almost gently, and touched 2 fingers to her cheek where the shape of his hand was already coming up red. She held them there for a moment, not comforting the spot, not covering it, pressing once the way a person checks whether a bone underneath has moved. Then she lowered her hand back to the bar and set it flat. And 6 stools away, Danny Okafor felt every hair on his arm stand up because he had seen that hand position exactly one time before in his entire life. Not in a bar, not on a civilian. On a training deck 4 years earlier, watching an instructor settle her weight a half second before demonstrating what a trained body actually does when it stops holding back. He said his friend's name out loud. His voice did not come out right. He said it again louder and told him to get away from her. Just Merrick's hand had already drifted under the bar toward the phone he kept there for calling base security. It stopped halfway. 22 years in uniform and 14 behind that counter had taught him one thing above all others, and it was that the people who yell back are never the ones you need to worry about. He looked at the woman sitting perfectly still, with a red handprint rising on her face and both palms flat on his bar, and he understood with a certainty that made his mouth go dry that he was not about to witness something terrible happening to her. I was about to witness something terrible happening to Bryce Tanner. Tanner, riding the last of his own adrenaline, leaned in one more time close enough that she could smell the beer on him and asked her whether she was going to cry now or just sit there. And Marin Vance, who had spent 11 years teaching herself to be nobody, in rooms exactly like this one, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and made a decision she had promised herself for 3 straight years she would never make again. It took 1.5 seconds, and every person in that building would spend years afterward trying to describe it in slow motion, the way people always do when their minds refuse to process something at the speed it actually happened. There was no punch. That was the first thing that broke their understanding of it. Nobody in Salt and Iron saw a fist because there was not one. What Marin Vance did with her left hand was not violence in any shape those men had been trained to recognize. It was closer to correction. Tanner was leaning in, and leaning in is momentum, and momentum belongs to whoever is willing to take it. She took it. Her hand moved once low and economical, and his own weight stopped being his own. His balance was gone before his brain had any idea something was wrong. That was the part Okafor kept coming back to later in the dark at 2 in the morning. Tanner's face never got the chance to register alarm. It went straight from contempt to confusion, skipping every emotion in between, because his body was already falling and his mind had not been invited. There was a second motion. Quick, almost gentle, almost polite. 210 pounds of muscle and beer and wounded pride hit the footrail of the bar's shoulder first, and the sound of it was the loudest thing that room had produced all night, a heavy flat thud followed by the clatter of a stool going over. And then nothing. No second strike, no follow-up, no standing over him. Marin Vance sat exactly where she had been sitting, both palms flat on the bar, in precisely the position they had occupied 10 seconds earlier, as though the man groaning at her feet had simply tripped over his own boots on his way past her. The silence that came next was not the silence of a bar holding its breath before a fight. Everyone in that building had heard that silence before. This was something else entirely. This was 40 people simultaneously discovering that they did not own the vocabulary for what they had just watched. One of the young ones was half out of his chair, frozen there, mouth open, beer still in his hand. Another had taken an actual step backward, not toward the exit, just away the animal part of him, putting distance between himself and something it had correctly identified as out of category. Gus Merrick stood behind his own bar with a rag hanging from his fingers and an expression that had changed twice in 2 seconds, from alarm to something much closer to recognition. And Danny Okafor, who had felt the cold drop in his stomach a full 4 seconds before it happened, heard his own voice come out of him without permission and say that this was not a bar fight. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. On the floor, Tanner tried to push himself upright and got halfway there before his shoulder reminded him that it had absorbed the whole impact. His hand came away from it and found nothing. No blood, no break, nothing he could hold up to the room and point at as an injury worth what was currently happening to his chest, which was a cold, spreading humiliation with no bottom to it. He looked up at her and truly looked at her for the first time all night, the way a man only ever looks at something after it has already proven he misjudged it completely. He asked what that was. His voice cracked on the second word. She did not answer him. She glanced once toward the table where Okafor was standing, and for a fraction of a second, something passed between the two of them that nobody else in that bar was equipped to see. It was not a warning. It was not an apology. It was closer to acknowledgement, one professional registering the instincts of another across a distance neither of them could name out loud. Then she reached into her back pocket, pulled out a few folded bills, and set them on the bar beside the water still spreading across the wood. More than her tab, extra for Gus, who was staring at her like a man trying to place a face out of a memory that would not come all the way forward. Gus told her she did not have to leave on his account. She said she was leaving on her own account. She smoothed the front of her shirt with one hand, a small automatic gesture she had performed 10,000 times in her life and no longer noticed. And she looked down at Tanner one last time. There was no triumph in it. There was no satisfaction. What crossed her face for half a second was tiredness, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been standing in this exact moment before in one form or another more times than she cared to count. She told him he should be more careful about who he assumes is weak. One of the young sailors found his voice and asked whether she needed them to call somebody. She said she was fine and that she appreciated it, and she said it kindly, which somehow landed harder than if she had said nothing. He started to ask where she had learned to do that and lost his nerve before the question finished. She told him good night, and the gentleness in it closed the conversation more completely than any sharp answer could have. Then she walked out, and she did not look back, and the door swung shut behind her with a soft click that somehow registered louder than the slap had. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then everybody moved at once, and the noise came back into that room. Wrong too loud, too fast. 40 people trying to talk their way back to normal, and none of them managing it. Okafor did not join in. He drifted toward the stool where she had been sitting because something in him needed to stand where she had stood, and his eyes were already moving across the bar top before he understood he was searching for anything. That was when he saw it. Half submerged in the spreading puddle dark against the pale wood sat a coin. Not currency. Nothing that would ever come out of a person's pocket change. It was the size of a silver dollar, and it had been carried so long that the edges had gone smooth, the way a stone goes smooth in a river. The face of it was worn down almost to nothing, but the markings that remained were not decorative. They were deliberate. Anyone who had spent time around units that issue such things would know it on sight, and Okafor had spent exactly enough time around one such man to know he was looking at something he should not be looking at. He picked it up carefully. Water ran off his fingers. He turned it once under the light, and his stomach dropped straight through the floor. He told them they needed to see this. One of them leaned over his shoulder and said it looked like a poker chip. Okafor said it was not a poker chip. He said he had seen one almost exactly like it one time in his uncle's garage, mounted in a shadow box that his uncle refused to explain. 2 deployments with naval special warfare, and the man had never once said what unit that coin came from. He had said only that some things a person does not ask about, and he had said it in a voice that ended the conversation permanently. Somebody asked what that meant. It meant, Okafor said, turning it again, that the woman who had just put Bryce Tanner on the floor in under 2 seconds had not left behind a coincidence. She had left behind a calling card, and either she had wanted them to find it or she had not even noticed it fall, which was somehow worse because that would mean she had not been thinking about any of them enough to notice. Tanner, sitting in a chair now with his shoulder throbbing and his pride in considerably worse condition, said it did not mean anything. He said it could belong to anybody. Could be a souvenir. Could be her father's. Okafor agreed that it could be. Then he asked Tanner honestly whether what had just happened to him had felt like luck. Tanner did not answer. The silence stretched out long enough to become its own answer, and Gus Merrick finally said the thing that none of them wanted to hear. He said he had worked that bar for 14 years and had watched drunk sailors throw hands, watched trained men throw hands, watched amateur fighters come through, thinking they were something special. He set the rag down and looked at the door she had walked through and said he had never once seen anything like that. Not from anybody. Somebody asked what he meant by that. He said he meant that whoever that woman was, she was not somebody any of them should have put their hands on. Okafor was already out the door 40 seconds later, phone up, photographing the coin under the parking lot lights from 3 angles because his hands did not trust the first 2. He sent all 3 to his uncle at 11:41 at night with a single line asking if he knew what it was. His uncle did not answer. Not that night, not the next morning, not by noon, and in the space where that answer should have been, Bryce Tanner did the single stupidest thing of his entire career. I went to the gym at 6 in the morning and hit a heavy bag until his knuckles bled through the wraps, and somewhere in there he decided that the story people were going to tell about Friday night was not going to be the story that had actually happened. So he walked into an office at 8:15 and filed a formal complaint stating that an unidentified female civilian had assaulted him at a bar off base. Okafor found out about it from a text and nearly dropped his phone. He found Tanner still at the gym, still soaked through, and told him he had made a mistake. Tanner said she had put her hands on him, and that was assault. Okafor reminded him flatly that he had slapped her first in front of 40 witnesses and that half of them had phones. Tanner said he had tapped her. Okafor said she had put him on the floor in front of his own people and that Tanner was about to hand a written record of the worst moment of his life to strangers who would not be kind with it. Tanner said the law did not care who she was. And Okafor said the thing he had been circling since midnight, which was that he had photographed a coin, sent it to a man who had 2 deployments behind him, and a security clearance he never discussed, and that man had now gone silent for 32 hours. He said that was not busy. He said a man who was busy sends back a question mark. A man who takes one look at something and decides he wants his name nowhere near it goes silent. Tanner told him to stop being dramatic. I would remember saying that. He would remember it for years. Across town that same Saturday morning, Marin Vance was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store with her fingers wrapped around the handle of a cart when a kid 4 feet away dropped a jar of pasta sauce. The glass went off like something else entirely. She did not scream. She did not duck. What happened to her was worse than either of those because it happened entirely on the inside where nobody could see it and nobody could help. Her hearing dropped out. Her hands locked on the cart handle so hard that her knuckles went white and stayed that way. And for somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds, Marin Vance was not standing in a grocery store in Virginia at all. She was somewhere with sand under her and salt water in her mouth and a man's weight against her shoulder that had already stopped being a man and become a load she had to carry. She counted, 4 in, 4 held, 4 out. She had learned it from a woman at a clinic she stopped attending after 6 sessions because she could not stand the way the intake form asked her to describe the event. A store employee touched her elbow and asked if she was all right. She smiled and said she was fine and that she had just startled Easy her whole life, and she said it so smoothly and so warmly that the kid believed her completely and went to get a mop, and Marin stood there for another 10 seconds, waiting for her hands to come off the cart handle. She left without buying anything. She drove 20 minutes north and parked at the edge of a gravel lot beside a youth soccer complex, 100 yards out, engine off, and she watched a 12-year-old girl with her hair pulled up play the second half of a Saturday morning game. She did not get out of the car. She never got out of the car. She had been doing this for 6 years, 3 or 4 times a season, always from a distance, always from a different spot in the lot. Nobody at that field had any idea who she was. The girl certainly did not. To that child, she was nothing less than nothing a parked sedan in a lot full of parked sedans. The girl's name was Sophie. Her father had been dead 11 years. And every August since Sophie was 6 years old, a check had arrived from an account with no name attached to it, and her mother had stopped asking questions about it around year 3 because the answer she suspected was one she could not carry. Marin watched the whole second half. Then she drove home and sat in her kitchen with the lights off. By Monday, the thing Tanner had set in motion was no longer in anyone's hands. It moved faster than any disciplinary process is supposed to move. And that was the first sign that something else was steering it. A senior chief took Okafor's statement and listened to his account of the technique. One motion to break balance, a second to put a man down. No wasted movement, no follow-up strike, and wrote down almost none of it, while his pen moved slowly enough to suggest he was having 2 conversations at once, and only one of them out loud. Then a public affairs officer nobody recognized walked into a common area and asked with elaborate casualness whether anyone happened to know if the bar's parking lot camera recorded overnight. Nobody had thought about a parking lot camera. Okafor did the arithmetic on that at lunch and lost his appetite. By Monday afternoon, a friend in communications told him that records had been pulled on salt and iron inside of 11 hours, that calls had been made, and that nobody could say by whom. Somebody wanted to know whether anyone had a clear photograph of the woman's face. Somebody wanted to know whether anyone had gotten a plate. And somebody wanted Tanner's complaint gone immediately and was not being remotely subtle about wanting it. Okafor asked who wanted it gone. His friend said that was the entire point. Nobody knew. He found Tanner in the barracks at 4 that afternoon and stopped in the doorway because the man sitting on the edge of that bunk was not the man who had been hitting a heavy bag on Saturday morning. The fury was gone. All of it. What had replaced it was something Okafor had never once seen on Bryce Tanner's face in 3 years of knowing him, and it took him a second to identify it as fear. 2 men had come to see him, not from that base, no insignia he recognized. They had asked him to repeat word for word exactly what he had said to the woman at the bar, and when he finished, they had made him do it again. And then a third time. Tanner said he had told them the truth. that he had said things he should not have said. He had touched her when he should not have touched her. His voice caught on the word touched, and Okafor understood that it was the first time in his life the man had described his own behavior honestly and heard how it sounded. Then Tanner said one of them had asked him whether he had any idea how close he had come to a permanent disciplinary action that would have ended his career before lunch. Not a review, not an administrative action. Permanent, and then the man had simply waited watching him to see whether he understood what that word meant. Tanner said he had not understood. He said he thought that was the part that scared the man. And before they left, the quieter one, the one who had barely spoken the entire time, had told him to withdraw the complaint for his own sake. He had said that some debts a man does not want to be the one collecting. Okafor asked him what unit they were with. Tanner said they never told him. He had withdrawn the complaint 20 minutes after they walked out, and his hands had been unsteady, doing it, and he had not stopped thinking about that word since. Debts. Okafor got back to his apartment at 6:30 that evening with the coin in his jacket pocket, and his phone buzzed on the counter while he was still standing in the doorway. His uncle. 51 hours of silence, and then 4 words. Where did you see that? Okafor typed back, fast, telling him about a bar outside the base, a woman, a man on the floor in under 2 seconds. He asked if his uncle knew what it was. The reply took almost 4 minutes, long enough that Okafor paced his own kitchen twice. His uncle wrote that he knew exactly what it was, that Danny needed to delete every photograph of it right now off every device and never mention it to another living person as long as he lived. He wrote that he was not joking. Okafor asked why. His uncle wrote that the coin belonged to a program that officially does not exist, that the handful of people who carry one are not people anybody wants noticing that they have been noticed, and that if a woman carrying that coin had allowed herself to end up in a position where a room full of strangers saw her move like that, then it was either the worst mistake of her career or it was not a mistake at all. Okafor asked what that meant. His uncle wrote that some people who do that kind of work get put somewhere quiet afterward, somewhere ordinary, somewhere nobody is supposed to be looking for them. And that if this woman was one of them, the only question that mattered was why she had let herself be found. Danny Okafor set the phone face down on the counter with a hand that was not steady and looked at the coin sitting under his kitchen light and understood that he had not stumbled on to the end of a strange story at all. 11 miles away in a rented house with 2 boxes still unopened in the closet, Marin Vance opened her laptop in the dark and found a message that had been waiting 4 hours. She had read it 11 times already. 900 tomorrow. You know where. No name attached. None needed. She knew the cadence of that sentence the way a person knows a voice they have not heard in a decade and would still recognize instantly in a crowded room. She closed the laptop and sat there with her cheek still faintly tender and understood that the slap had never been the dangerous part of Friday night. Tomorrow took 9 days to arrive, and every one of them cost her something. Hale had wanted 3 weeks. He got 9 days because on the 4th day, the broker Salcedo hired came back with a name, and on the 5th day, a records request landed on a county clerk's desk in Virginia Beach, asking for property lease information on a residential address that was Marin's filed by a paralegal at a firm that did not exist. Hale called her at 6 in the morning to tell her about it, and she said the thing she had been rehearsing for 4 days, which was that they were done building and it was time to move. He said the case was not ready. She said the case would never be ready and that they had 2 choices left. Either Salcedo came for her on a night of his choosing at an address he already had, or he came to a room they controlled. Hale said he did not have the right to order her into anything after what had already been asked of her. She said she was not asking for an order. The plan they built in the following 70 hours was uglier than either of them wanted. Hale's people leaned on the broker, and the broker, being a businessman rather than a believer, sold Salcedo a meeting instead of an address. An old associate, someone who could confirm whether the woman was alive. A warehouse in Norfolk owned by a shell that Hale's office had quietly controlled since 2019. 2 exits, both covered, a federal tactical element staged behind a partition wall with a 90-second response window, which Hale said out loud 4 separate times in the briefing, in which Marin noticed him saying, and which told her he was more frightened than he was letting on. The night before, she did something she had not done in 11 years. She drove to the soccer complex and it was empty, and she sat in the lot anyway for 40 minutes. Then she took out her phone and typed a message to a number she had memorized 6 years ago and never once used. It was Sophie's mother's number. She wrote 4 sentences, deleted them, wrote 2 more, deleted those, and finally sent nothing at all because there was no version of that message that did not end with a 12-year-old girl learning something over breakfast that would take her years to survive. She put the phone face down and told the empty car that if it went badly, at least the checks would keep coming. She had set that up years ago. It was automatic. It would outlive her by decades. That was the closest Marin Vance came to writing a will. At 9:02 the following evening, Hale's voice came into her right ear and asked her to confirm position, and she said she was in position, and she was surprised at how steady it came out. The tactical lead confirmed both exits, confirmed eyes on the lot, and for 11 minutes nothing happened at all, which was the worst part because 11 minutes is long enough for a person to remember every single thing. She thought about Owen Dean's hands. That was what her mind always gave us first, not his face, his hands, the way he taped his own fingers before a swim, because he said the tape made him feel like an athlete instead of a target. She thought about the sound the water made. She thought about how she had stopped at the 4th minute of that swim and made a decision about a man who was still breathing and could not be brought, and how nobody in 11 years had ever asked her about that decision, because nobody in 11 years had known there was one to make. Headlights swept the far wall and went dark. The tactical voice said single occupant, matching description, and Marin felt her pulse do the thing it had always done, which was slow down. Then the door opened, and Dario Salcedo walked into the room, and everything she had built for 3 years fell off her like a coat. He stopped 4 steps in. He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. He said she was supposed to be dead. She said she got that a lot. Neither of them moved. His eyes went once toward the door behind him, doing the arithmetic that had kept him alive on borrowed time for over a decade, and she watched him do it, and she let him, because every second he spent calculating was a second being recorded. He said she had set this up. The broker, the information, all of it. She said she had wanted him to answer for it. He said he had not had a choice. He said they had threatened his family that they would have killed them, and that she had no idea what it was like to be given that kind of choice. And Marin said the sentence she had been carrying for 11 years and had never once been able to deliver to the person it belonged to. She said he had a choice, and he chose money, and a man who trusted him with his life paid for that choice on a beach, and his daughter had been 13 months old. Salcedo's composure came apart in a way she had not expected. He said the girl's name. He said Sophie, and Marin felt the floor tilt because that name had never been in any file he could have accessed. She asked him how he knew that. He said Owen had told him 6 days before, over dinner in a country neither of them belonged in, showing him a photograph on a phone the way any father does. And he said it with a face that had finally stopped performing, and that was the exact moment Marin Vance understood that Dario Salcedo had known precisely what he was selling and had done it anyway. She had spent 11 years believing he had sold coordinates, a grid, numbers on a page. He had sold a man whose child's name he knew. Something rose in her chest so fast and so hot that for a full second she genuinely did not know what she was going to do, and it was the first time in her adult life that had ever been true. His hand moved toward his jacket. She told him not to. She told him he really did not want to find out what happened if he finished that motion. He froze and his breathing was audible, and she said the rest of it flat and even. Federal tactical element on both exits. Every word he had said in the last 90 seconds recorded. The only decision left to him was whether he walked out in handcuffs or made a mistake in the next 3 seconds that ended considerably worse. His hand came down. She said, "Good." And then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge. Every light in that building went at once, which meant a breaker, which meant a hand on a breaker, which meant somebody was inside the wall of that warehouse and had been for long enough to find it. Hale's voice came into her ear and got cut in half by static. There were 2 of them. She heard the first one moving before she heard anything else, and she heard him on her right, which meant she heard him at all, and she thanked God for the geometry of that in a way she never had before. The tactical element came through the partition at 4 seconds and took fire at 6. She heard a man go down, and she heard him swear in a way that told her it had gone through the shoulder and not the chest. And then the second shooter opened up toward the sound of that voice, and the whole room turned into noise. 90 seconds Hale had promised. She had 8. The math was simple and horrible. The wounded man was on the floor in open ground between two positions. The second shooter was walking his fire toward him, deliberately not spraying, adjusting, which meant a professional, which meant he would find him. And Myron could not hear the first shooter anymore because the first shooter had moved to her left. That was the thing she had lived with for 11 years and had never once had to pay for until that exact moment. 40% gone. A whole hemisphere of the world where sound went to die. She could not place him. She had no idea if he was 6 feet away or 20, and she felt something she had not felt since the water, which was the specific terror of being deaf on a side that mattered. So she stopped trying to solve it and changed the problem instead. She put her back against the wall. Everything that came at her now had to come through her right ear because she had removed the entire left half of the world from play. It cost her mobility, and it cost her every option except one, and it bought her the only thing she needed, which was accurate hearing on a single axis. She heard him at 11 feet. What happened next took under 2 seconds, and there was no witness to it in any usable sense because the room was dark and the only people conscious in it were busy. He came in close because darkness makes men come in close, and she let him arrive, and she took his momentum, the way she had taken Bryce Tanner's in a bar 9 days earlier, except that this man was armed, and this time she did not stop at putting him on the floor. She broke the arm holding the weapon. She did it cleanly, and she did it in one motion, and she took the weapon with her when she moved. She did not kill him. She would think about that later and not be able to fully explain it. The second shooter was still adjusting toward the wounded officer, and he never heard her coming because he was listening for boots, and she had not been wearing the kind that make noise since she was 27 years old. She put him down at 4 feet. He went hard and he stayed down, and she kicked the weapon 11 feet across the floor into the dark. Then the lights came back, and there was a man in the doorway who should not have been in that building at all. Bryce Tanner had the wounded officer's collar in one fist and was dragging him backward out of the open, and his other hand was jammed into the man's shoulder with the whole weight of his upper body on top of it, and there was so much blood on his forearms that Marin's first thought was that he had been hit himself. He had not. He had a trauma kit open on the floor beside him that he had not brought because Danny Okafor had brought it, and Okafor was on his knees on the other side of the man with a tourniquet, high and tight on the arm, saying the numbers out loud the way corpsmen do, counting the seconds since application, because he had learned to count them before he learned to shave. Neither of them was supposed to be within 4 miles of that building. Okafor had figured it out on his own, which was the entire reason Lang had noticed him in the first place. A quiet man asking about a warehouse, a shell company with a lease. He had made a phone call he had promised not to make, and he had made it anyway, and Lang had told him the truth, which was that he could not stop him from being in a parking lot on public property, and had then given him a location and an hour, and hung up without another word. Okafor had gone to Tanner because Tanner had a truck, and because something in him had wanted badly to give the man one chance to be somebody other than who he had been on a Friday night. Tanner had not asked a single question. He had gotten his keys. He had said one sentence on the drive, according to Okafor later, which was that he wanted to be somewhere that nobody was going to clap for him. Now he was kneeling in another man's blood, holding pressure with both hands, and when Marin came into his field of vision, he looked up at her, and neither of them said anything at all. He went back to holding pressure. That was the whole exchange. It was enough. Salcedo was face down and cuffed by then, and he had not fought at all, and he never once looked in Marin's direction again for the rest of his life. The wounded officer kept his arm. He kept it because a tourniquet went on at 14 seconds and pressure went on at 9. And the surgeon at the trauma center said as much to Okafor 2 days later in a hallway, and Okafor had to go sit in a stairwell afterward for a while. Hale reached Marin in the parking lot 20 minutes later and looked at her hands and then at her face and said only that she was not supposed to have been alone in there. She said she had not been. Not this time. The case did not take 6 months. It took 11 because the arrest cracked open a cooperation cascade that Hale's prosecutor had not dared hope for 4 separate people racing each other to reduce their own exposure. And by the time it reached a courtroom, the file against Dario Salcedo weighed more than the original operation ever had. Marin testified for 3 hours and 40 minutes. She recounted the coastline, the 4 sailors, the compromise. She named Owen Dean out loud in a public room for the first time in 11 years. And her voice did not do anything at all, which cost her more than crying would have. The defense attorney went after her memory. It was the only door left and he walked through it. He suggested carefully in the language they use that trauma of the kind she described is known to distort recollection, and that 11 years is a long time, and that a person under that kind of stress might reasonably confuse the sequence of events. She looked at the jury instead of at him. She said she remembered every second of that night. She said she remembered it because she had lived inside it every night for 11 years. She said trauma does not erase memory, counselor. Sometimes it carves it deeper than anything else ever could. The attorney sat down and did not ask a second question. The jury came back in under 3 hours. Outside afterward, she was sitting alone with her hands in her lap when a woman she had never spoken to in her life crossed the corridor toward her with a 12-year-old girl beside her. Sophie Dean had her father's habit of standing with her weight on one foot, and Myron had to look at the floor for a second. The girl asked if she was the woman who was with her dad. Marin said she was. The girl asked if it was true that he was trying to help people when it happened. And Marin said yes, and then she said the rest of it because the child had waited 11 years and had been handed the word classified her entire life instead of an answer. She said his name. She said he went in first because he always went in first. She said the 4 people he went in for are alive right now, all 4 of them, and 2 of them have children who exist because Owen Dean decided something in about a second and a half. Sophie's mother put a hand over her mouth. The girl was quiet for a moment, and then she asked in the way that only children ask whether Marin was the one who had been sending the money. Marin did not answer. The girl said okay, and then she said thank you. And then she asked very simply whether Marin would come to a game sometime and actually get out of the car. And that was the thing that finally did it. Not the courtroom, not the warehouse, not the 11 years. A 12-year-old girl who had known about the gray sedan in the parking lot for 2 seasons and had never told her mother, because some part of her had understood that whoever was in that car was not there to take anything from her. Marin Vance said yes and could not say anything else for a while. She got out of the car 3 weeks later, and it was harder than the warehouse. That was not an exaggeration, and she would have said so out loud to anyone who asked. In the warehouse, she had known what her body was for. In a parking lot on a Saturday morning, walking 100 yards toward a chain-link fence with a folding chair under her arm, because Sophie's mother had told her to bring one, Marin Vance had no idea what any part of her was for. She got about 40 yards before she stopped. Sophie saw her from the field and did the thing that undid her completely, which was that she did not wave. She just watched the way a person watches something they have been told is going to happen and did not fully believe until it did, and then she turned around and went back to warming up because she was 12 and there was a game. Marin sat in the chair for 90 minutes and understood almost nothing about what she was watching and did not care. Afterward, the girl came over sweating and asked her what she thought, and Marin said she thought Sophie held her shoulders too square when she ran, and that it was costing her about a step, and that her father had done exactly the same thing his entire life, and had never once been able to fix it. Sophie stood there for a second. Then she said nobody had ever told her anything her dad did wrong before. She said everybody only ever told her the good parts, and that after 11 years the good parts had stopped feeling like a person. And Marin said she had about 400 bad parts if the girl wanted them. Sophie said yes. She said it fast, and she said it in a way that made her mother turn away and pretend to look for something in a bag. That was how it started, not with a speech, with a criticism of a running form. The rest of that year rearranged itself around things Marin Vance had spent a decade assuming were closed to her permanently. She testified twice more at the sentencing, and at a closed hearing, she was never allowed to describe. Dario Salcedo received a sentence that the reporters in the room called substantial, and that Marin privately considered irrelevant because the only number she had ever cared about was the one she gave the jury, which was 4. 4 people alive. That was the entire ledger. Everything else was administration. She did not go to the sentencing hearing to watch him. She went because the prosecutor said the family of the second engineer, one of the 4, wanted to be in the room and had asked whether the woman who swam them out would be there. She had not known any of them survived with memories of her. She had assumed she was a shape in dark water. The second engineer was 61 now, and he cried before he got a full sentence out, and he held both her hands with the specific desperate grip of a man who has waited 11 years to say a thing and is now discovering that there is no correct way to say it. He said he had named a boat after her. He said he had never known her name, so he had named it after the only word he had heard her say that night, which had been a direction in a language he did not speak, shouted twice. He said the boat was called Left, and Marin Vance, who had not laughed in a room full of strangers since she was 27 years old, laughed so hard she had to sit down. Bryce Tanner was never formally disciplined for the bar. The withdrawn complaint made sure of it, and the paperwork from the warehouse night went into a file that nobody at his command was ever cleared to open. So on the official record of his career, the entire thing amounted to a two-line administrative note and a signature. Unofficially, it destroyed him and then rebuilt him, and it took about a year. He stopped drinking on Fridays for 4 months, which everyone noticed and nobody mentioned. He came back to it eventually, but he came back different. He stopped holding court. He stopped telling the stories he had been telling for a decade. And when a younger sailor tried to hand him the floor, the way sailors do, he would answer in 4 words and let the conversation go somewhere else. The thing that changed him was not being put on a floor. He would have recovered from that in a month with his personality intact. The thing that changed him was kneeling in a warehouse with both hands inside another man's shoulder, doing something that mattered in a room where absolutely nobody was watching him do it, and discovering that it was the first time in his adult life he had felt like a person instead of a performance. He told Okafor that exactly once in a truck at 2 in the morning and never brought it up again. And what people did notice over the following year was that Chief Tanner had developed a strange habit. He watched the quiet ones. In a room, in a chow hall, in a bar, his eyes would find the person who was not talking and stay there a beat longer than made sense. And he never explained it, and the younger sailors decided it was just one of his things. It was not one of his things, it was a scar. Twice that year, he stepped in on somebody else doing what he had done. Both times he did it early before it escalated, and both times he did it in a way that let the other man walk away with something left. He had learned exactly how much a person loses when nobody stops them in time, and he had learned it at a price he was not willing to let anybody else pay. He never learned her name. He asked once at the very end of it, and Okafor told him no. And he accepted that, and that acceptance was the last piece of the man he used to be falling off. Danny Okafor was approached 7 months after the trial. It was not dramatic. It was a phone call and a coffee and a set of questions that took 4 hours and never once touched on anything he had expected. They did not ask him about his run times. They asked him what he had noticed about the woman at the bar and in what order and how long it had taken him. He told them the truth, 40 minutes. The phone. He said everybody notices a person who is dangerous. He said what he had noticed was a person who was carefully not being anything, and that the carefulness was the tell. The man across the table wrote nothing down and then said that most people cannot articulate that even after they are trained to do it. Okafor asked at the end if she had been the one who put his name forward. They did not answer him. He decided that was an answer. He entered the selection pipeline the following spring, and it broke him twice, and he went back both times, and the thing he thought about at the worst hour of the worst week was not his family and not his pride. It was a woman with a red handprint coming up on her face, sitting perfectly still, with both palms flat on a bar calculating. He made it through. And on the day he did an envelope, arrived at his mother's house with no return address, containing no letter holding, only a coin with the edges worn smooth from years in somebody's pocket. He never found out how it got there. He stopped trying to find out after a week. He carried it for the rest of his career, and he never showed it to anyone. And when younger men asked about it, he said only that some things you do not ask about, which was exactly what his uncle had said to him in a garage years earlier. And he understood at last that his uncle had not been protecting a secret. He had been protecting a person. Marin went back to Salt and Iron on a Friday night, 14 months after the last time she had walked out of it. She sat at the far right end of the bar, same stool, same reason which she now understood she would never stop having, because the ear was not coming back and neither was the habit. Gus Merrick put a glass of water in front of her without being asked, and then he did something he had not done for a customer in 14 years, which was that he came around the end of the bar, pulled out the stool beside her, and sat down. He said he had thought about her for a year. She said she was sorry about the mess. He said she had left him a $40 tip on an $11 tab and had put a man on the floor without breaking a single one of his glasses, and that he had been in the business long enough to know that was the most polite thing anyone had ever done to him. Then he told her something she had not known. He said that on the night it happened after she left, he had gone into the back and sat down on a crate for 20 minutes because he had spent 22 years in uniform and 14 behind that bar. And he had spent every one of them telling himself that he had gotten out at the right time and that he had never once regretted it. He said watching her sit there with a handprint on her face not moving had been the first time in 3 decades he had been ashamed of the poor of his own life. He said he had wanted to be the one who stopped it. He had reached under the bar, and then he had understood in about a second that he was not going to be fast enough, and that she did not need him to be, and that both of those facts were going to sit in his chest for a long time. Marin looked at him for a while. Then she told him he was wrong about one thing. She said she had heard him. She said that when he put both hands on that bar and told Tanner to step back, she had heard him with her good ear from 6 feet away, and that it was the only reason she had given the man a second warning instead of ending it at the first. She said Gus Merrick had bought Bryce Tanner about 4 extra seconds of his own life choices, and that most people never get told when they do something like that, so she was telling him. The old man's jaw worked, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he got up and went back behind his bar, and he did not charge her for anything ever again for the rest of the time she lived in that state. Hale offered her the position in the spring. Not fieldwork, a training program, 3 states away, teaching selection candidates, the things that do not appear in any manual and cannot be graded on a range. She said no the first time. She said no because she had spent 11 years being what that program made her, and she was not certain she wanted to hand the same thing to somebody else's daughter. Hale did not argue. He said one sentence and hung up. He said that the program was going to keep producing people like her, whether she taught them or not, and the only variable was whether any of those people would have somebody who told them the truth about the after. She called him back 2 days later and said yes. The class she stood in front of the following autumn had 14 candidates in it, and she did not raise her voice once in the first 6 weeks. She was not soft. She failed 4 of them. She failed one for the specific reason that he could not stop performing, that everything he did was aimed at somebody watching, and she told him to his face that the habit would get someone killed and that he should be grateful it was her catching it and not a coastline. He hated her for about a year and then wrote her a letter. What she taught them was not technique. They had technique. What she taught them was the part nobody had taught her, which was that the job would eventually hand them a night that did not end when the operation did, and that they would spend a decade or more carrying it, and that the carrying was not weakness and not damage and not something to be hidden from a form at a clinic. She told them about the grocery store. All of it. The jar, the 20 seconds the hands locked on the cart. She told 14 selection candidates that a woman who had swum 4 people 900 meters through dark water had once been immobilized in a cereal aisle by a child dropping pasta sauce, and that both of those things were true about the same person on the same nervous system, and that anyone who could not hold both of those facts at once was not going to survive this career intact. Nobody in that room ever forgot it. On the last day of the cycle, she said the only thing she had ever prepared in advance. She told them the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. She said it is the one who does not need anything from anybody in it. She said they would spend the next 20 years in rooms full of men who needed to be the loudest thing present, and that every one of those men would eventually meet somebody who had nothing to prove, and that it would go badly for them and they would never understand why. She said, remember that. And then she said the part that mattered more. She said, remember it hardest on the days when proving yourself feels like the only thing in the world that matters, because those are the days you become the loud one. In the back row, a young woman who had spent her entire life being talked over by people who mistook her quiet for weakness sat up straight and did not move for the rest of the hour. Marin noticed. She always noticed. 3 years later, that same woman would pull 2 people out of a situation on a coastline that no official record will ever describe, and she would do it without raising her voice, and afterward, she would sit alone for a long time and think about a training room in a sentence. Sophie Dean turned 15 and stopped being polite about her questions, which Marin considered enormous progress. They saw each other most months. Sometimes it was a game. Sometimes it was a diner. Sophie asked hard things the way children do once they decide an adult will not lie to them. And Marin answered every single one she was legally able to answer, and said so plainly when she could not. Once Sophie asked whether she thought about that night a lot. Marin said every day. Sophie asked if it ever got better. And Marin said no. She said it does not get better, it gets carried differently. She said the weight does not change, but a person can get stronger, and eventually the same weight stops being the only thing they can hold. Sophie thought about that for a long time and then said that was the first honest answer any adult had ever given her about her father. The two boxes came out of the closet on a Sunday afternoon in the fourth year. She unpacked both of them in 90 minutes. There was less inside than she had built them up to contain. Photographs, a folded flag, a tape measure that had belonged to her own father, a citation for something she had done at 29 that nobody in her current life would ever be permitted to read. She put the photographs on a wall for the first time in 11 years, and she sat down on the floor of a house she finally owned instead of rented, and she looked at a picture of Owen Dean laughing at something outside the frame, and she said out loud that she had gotten Sophie to 15. She said the rest of it was going to be all right. Then she got up and made dinner, and the house did not have teeth in it anymore. She would never be an ordinary woman in an ordinary bar. She understood that finally and stopped grieving it. She would always sit at the right end of a room. She would always count the exits without deciding to. A dropped glass would always cost her 20 seconds, somewhere she could not be reached. But she had stopped disappearing, and that was the only thing she had ever actually wanted. Because survival was never about being the loudest voice in the room or the fastest hand in a fight. It was about enduring long enough to reach the moment when your silence finally meant something, when your restraint proved stronger than another person's rage, and when the truth you carried alone for 11 years finally found the daylight it had always deserved. They slapped the wrong woman in a bar, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not raise her hand a second time. She simply stood up 11 years later in a courtroom and told the truth, and that was the blow that finally landed.